It's Decoration Day here today. As I understand it, Decoration Day began in the South, and it's when the people would gather around on a Sunday once a year and put flowers on the graves of the war dead. And then it got spread around and became a national holiday and called it Memorial Day. And it didn't fall on a Sunday all the time. But in the old days, well, even here today, but it started in earlier times. Most of the churches had an associated cemetery, and then there were cemeteries without a church. But they would have these decoration days on a Sunday, and it would be a community get-together where they would bring in covered dishes and picnic under the trees and socialize, and family that lived in other areas would come back to the decoration, and they'd put flowers on the graves and visit with family. And they staggered these gatherings, not necessarily on the same day. If it was conflicting, if there were going to be two decorations that might have the same people that would want to go, and they were too far to do on the same day, and back then they walked or rode horses or wagons, so they would stagger these out over 3 or 4 Sundays so people could go to the ones they wanted to. And it was a big event, and it was always on a Sunday. Now it's evolved to where people start still the first June Sunday, first Sunday in June that we have is when the decoration is at the cemetery where my family's buried, most of them. And so people now start on Friday decorating, and some people even just do it on on official Memorial Day, because that's when they're off and they don't necessarily live very close. So it's not nearly the shindig it used to be, but this whole thing is that I have people buried close by who have been here since the 1790s. One of my grandpas came here from what was Orange County, North Carolina at the time. It's Alamance County now. They divided the county because it was big, but he's buried over here about a mile from where I am. One of the cemeteries that's still intact from the old days. A lot of these cemeteries are built closer to the river, the Clinch or the Powell River, or Big Creek. There's a lot of big feeder streams coming into what becomes the Clinch River. But TVA moved those graves. They were going to be covered by water, so they moved the graves and reinterred the people. So, but this one graveyard over there is still, it was on a hilltop, and it's still intact, and got people buried there from the early 1800s up through, in the last year or two, there have been a few people buried there. But this land was originally Cherokee land, and they had the Indian Removal Act about, I think it was 1835 or 35, I think, 34 or 5, in that range, and they rounded up all the people they could catch and took them out to Oklahoma and gave them a new home. Them people didn't want to go. It was a rough time. Thousands died. Some from the trip and some from just heartbreak. A handful of those people hid out in the hills, and I'm sure I and most of the people who have family been here for a while have some of their blood in their veins. We are still tied to them in that way. Anyway, the government and all its wisdom moved those people out and left the mostly Scotch-Irish and what few Indians had hid out. They all stayed here and built this land up. And now I'm not going to tell you that this was a bustling area. There was no electricity here in 1936. But there was no electricity in most rural areas, so you can't say that it was actually really behind the times. And there was no heavy industry. There was coal mining and logging and farming. That's about it, and that's about all you'd find anywhere except in Detroit and Pittsburgh. Anyway, this is North Lake here. It was the first TVA lake. It was billed as navigation, flood control, and electricity. Now, it served those purposes. North Dam generated and generates electricity. Not nearly enough to do anything with anymore, but it's there. And navigation, yeah, it kind of moderated the river flow so that you could kind of plan on when you could take the barge or float or whatever. You could move up and down the river. Flood control, yes, it does. At one time, Chattanooga got flooded right often, but they flooded nearly 800,000 acres in the name of flood control. It has benefits. I am glad just for myself that there's not a bunch of people living right here. I own this little piece of property and I don't have another neighbor that I can see across the lake. There's plenty over in Anderson County, but there's no neighbors here that anywhere close to me. So I benefit in that way. But the people who used to live here, there was somebody who raised corn right here at one time. They traveled on the river that was right down this way and caught fish and lived here and lived a happy life. And then for the greater good, they got kicked out. They went through the official procedures laid out in the Fifth Amendment about taking property, and they come in and paid what they considered to be a fair price. But a fair price is not fair when you find something that's not for sale. Yeah, I have some hard feelings about that, but it didn't, I'm actually better off, I'm sure. But the people whose family had lived here for 150 years and got moved out, some of them were old and some of them died from a broken heart. Some of them committed suicide. They didn't want to leave. It was home. I guess what angers me the most is that this whole TVA project was more of a social experiment than it was the other purposes that they stated, because they wanted to build this perfect community. They, in fact, built Norris, the city of Norris down here, and it was just going to be a paradise for these poor backward hillbillies, and they could learn to make pottery and everything, and everybody'd just be so happy, and it'd be self-sustaining, and it didn't work out real good. Their planned community worked out like all other planned communities. It's just I got a spider here. Got rid of him. It was kind of like the descendants of the of the Indians who lived here before and got moved out. Their descendants, the family left here, although married and intermarried with others and whatnot. Anyway, they got kicked out again. It wasn't as brutal, but mentally it was just as brutal for the people who didn't want to leave. So today, one of the relatives that came here 1790 or so, he'll get some flowers stuck on his grave, and we'll all pretend like it was all above board and good and all's happy, and it's decoration day.